I'm a Master of Wine and I'm the Director of the promotional campaign for Georgian wine in the UK. Georgian wine exports to the UK are booming. They've increased by tenfold in the last year. I really hope you enjoy this edited webinar recording, which covers all the fundamentals of Georgian wine culture, history, regions, grape varieties, and special wine styles like qvevri. We would love to hear from you if you'd like to know more. You can get in touch using the contact details at the end of the slide. Garmanjos. So as I say, the aim of this hour is to give you sort of a really good overview of what's really happening in Georgia at the moment and what that means for our market. So as a wine lover, I found it really moving to discover in Georgia a really deep living history of humanity's relationship with wine. And as Oz Clarke puts it, Georgia uses methods of winemaking that you couldn't invent in the modern world. You could only invent them through the mists of time. I work with Oz, he's deeply poetic. And this is true of Georgia. There is this kind of almost mystical element, but then also, apart from Georgian qvevri, which this is a model of qvevri, this is what Oz was talking about. These are these ancient methods, an ancient vessel for winemaking. Quite apart from Georgian qvevri, there's actually a really established, dynamic, complex, varied contemporary wine industry in Georgia. And so Georgia isn't a kind of historical curiosity. Wine there isn't driven by a kind of lo-fi fetish for, ye oldie worldy. It's a really diverse contemporary wine producer for whom wine is incredibly important economically and socially. It's a significant contributor to social cohesion and to GDP as well. So Georgia is a really small country. It's kind of the same size as Scotland, mainland Scotland, and it's surrounded by some big covetous neighbours. It has a border with Russia, Turkey, Armenia and Azerbaijan. This tiny country is at this incredibly strategic location. And as a result of being at this crossroads between Europe and Asia, this is one of the great cradles of civilization. And if you do get to go to Tbilisi, one of the most thrilling things is that really you see in Georgia these layers of history and these influences that synthesize so many different cultures from all around the world. And that's also very evident in Georgia's food, which is fantastic. What's extraordinary about Georgia is that it's a really tiny country that has endured as a nation. So all around Georgia, massive empires have risen and fallen. The Ottomans, the Persians, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union. And Georgia has retained this very strong, vibrant identity. It has a unique language, an alphabet. It has a very spirited sense of itself. And this has been written about really beautifully by John Steinbeck and many great authors. So I recommend reading Steinbeck's Russian Journal, which is a fantastic insight into the countries of the Soviet Union before the Iron Curtain came down. And his descriptions of Georgia are really wonderful. The topography of Georgia is really dominated by the Caucasus. So the Caucasus are a massive mountain system that are at this link point at the intersection of Europe and Asia. You have the Greater and the Lesser Caucasus, and then many sub-mountain ranges. And the mountains really dominate the microclimate and the viticultural potential of Georgia. Georgia has massive diversity of climate and microclimate. Essentially, it's a land of grace agriculturally. The climate's benign and everything grows here, from apricots to apples, hazelnuts, tea, aubergines, cereals to vines and pasture. And this bounty is one reason that Georgia has always been coveted by its bigger neighbours and been subject to these waves of invasion through its history. The Black Sea is a key factor in determining the viticultural potential of Georgia, as are the Caucasus Mountains. So there's a huge range here protect Georgia from the cold air from the north. And then the Black Sea here has this moderating effect. All of these different potential altitudes means you have a staggering variety of climates. That's why you can grow so much. You have, for example, continental with subtropical influences here. In Batumi, palm trees grow. Here in Kutaisi, in Imereti, you're moving more into very mountainous influenced climate. Up here, you have alpine climates. So it's almost an a la carte microclimate choice. There's massive nuance and potential. Drought is not an issue, although they are starting to get a bit worried about that. They do feel there is some element of climate change, but broadly speaking, you have plentiful and good supply of groundwater because you have the snow melt and you also have a lot of springs. And in the valleys here, you have rivers that are fed by the streams from the mountains. So essentially it's thank you nature. I mean, Georgia has really been blessed with all these natural resources. So it's not surprising that with all this natural abundance, viticulture and winemaking has flourished here since the very earliest times of human civilization. So Georgia has one of the verified, uninterrupted histories of viticulture and winemaking. Basically, this land is just dying to make wine. It's its vocation, really. Cultivated grape pips date back to 8,000 years. You have a really rich viticultural and winemaking heritage and some very rich archaeological finds. Georgia has over 500 indigenous grape varieties. They have been catalogued and are being grown and protected and researched in Georgian government-owned agronomy centres. Even though these 500 varieties are an incredibly rich germplasm, it's highly localised, so particular varieties come from particular regions. But despite that, and despite the fact that vines historically were cultivated all over Georgia with very strong specialisation of variety to region, and that these vine varieties are unique to Georgia, what we're actually seeing now is that only around 25 of these 500 grape varieties are in common commercial usage. So of these regions in Georgia, we have Kakheti, Kartli, Imereti, and those are kind of the three main regions that are commercially thriving and exporting. You also then have these smaller, completely fascinating regions that are starting to export, but in very much smaller quantities. So Ajara, Guria, Rachalakumi, Samegrelo. Now, Abkhazia, actually you won't see because Abkhazia is currently under occupation. Georgia has 55,000 hectares of vines, which, just to put it in context, is a little bit more than Austria. It's half that of Germany and a quarter the amount of Chile. This is a relatively small wine producing nation, producing commercially about 25 different grape varieties with enormous potential for further development. 3/4 of Georgian wine production originated from one region, Kakheti, which is this region here in the far southeast. So if you get your head around Kakheti, you've really got your head around the majority of wine that you will see from Georgia. Kakheti has a really sunny, temperate climate, coolish winters, hot summers. So you see this borders Azerbaijan. There's warming influences that come up here, the protective influences of the mountains here, and you also have protective mountain influence here. So this is why you get a transitional continental climate. And vineyards in Kakheti hug the foothills from this valley floor, the Alazani River Valley. It produces 3/4 of the Georgian wine harvest, and it has 18 PDOs. And the main varieties used in Kakheti are the big three of Georgian wine production. And they are the white grapes, Rakatsiteli and Mutsvane, and the red grape, Saperavi. And these three grapes behind the PDOs of Kakheti. So, for example, you have the PDO of Sinandali. This is a blend of Rakatsiteli and Mutsvane. It kind of reminds me a bit of Georgian Chablis. Sinandali is an ancient PDO. It was the first protected appellation in Georgia, and it arose from the interaction during the Russian Empire of the nobility of Georgia with the expertise and the influence of the French. And this is where you have the beautiful estates like the estate of Sinandali, which has been restored, which is this exquisite, exotic French chateau transported to Georgia. You also have similar estates created around this time, like Chateau Mukrani, which is over here in Kartli. This kind of heritage actually means that there is a tradition of PDOs in Georgia. Rakatsiteli is the white grape, which is like the Chardonnay of Georgia. It's very malleable and it can convey terroir. It makes great skin contact wine. So, for example, another PDO in Kakheti is the PDO of Tibani, and this is a PDO for orange skin contact Rakatsiteli made in qvevri. You also have some very famous PDOs for red wines. The PDO of Naparuli, that's a PDO made from Saperavi grape. You also have the PDO of Mukuzani, which is another PDO for Saperavi. And Mukuzani gives really some of the richest, most stony, intense, long-lived versions of Saperavi. There are also so many wines made in Kakheti which don't come under a PDO. They're proprietary brands and labels. And it's just worth saying that the Georgian character is really creative. And this kind of Georgian creativity and individualism is very much part of the renaissance of Georgian wine. If you want to explore the details of Kakheti, then we've got some really good resources on our website called georgianwine.uk, and you can download the details of the PDOs and so on. But the main thing to take away is that you have white wines from Rakatsiteli and Mutsvane and red wines from Saperavi. Why is it that in this land of wine, so rich in vino diversity, with 9 regions, 500 native grapes, why is it that we have just 5% of those native varieties in common use and 3/4 of the planting and production focused on just one region? And the answer is, I think, pretty fascinating, and also explains why we think of Georgia as emerging. So why is it that with all this rich history, you have this focus in one part of the country and so few of the native varieties actually in common use? And the reason why is that from the 1920s onwards, Georgia was occupied and became part of the Soviet Union. And I just wanted to show you on the right, this is Freedom Square today in Tbilisi. Here's a picture of St. George. Hooray! This is what Freedom Square used to look like, and this is the statue of Lenin. So Georgia was taken into the Soviet Union. The Soviets thought they were kind of improving Georgia. So here was this nation where actually agricultural bounty, it was sunny and benign. It was where the party officials had their holiday homes. Agriculture was collectivized. So vineyards were seized by the state with tragic consequences for families that still resonate. And the inherently vibrant, varied wine culture that was all over the country was really homogenized. So private wine companies ceased to exist commercially. Production was consolidated and industrialized for efficient, reliable supply of wine to the Soviet Union. So production took place in government-owned wine factory units, numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And wine styles were consolidated and restricted. Individual families still kept their qvevri, and they would have their family qvevri, and they would make wine from their little plot of vines that had escaped official notice. They would home-make wine for themselves and their family, and this is why these old varieties have survived, because actually in little corners of Imereti and Sketi and these old regional areas, they were able to quietly carry on making wine, but for personal use. They couldn't commercialize it. So all the commercialization of Georgian wine under the Soviet era, all the way from 1920 to 1990, just think about what happened in the wine world globally in those years. But Georgia was cut off from us, and its only job and only kind of outlet and expression was to supply the Soviet Union from Kakheti. Kakheti is a really nice terroir for wine. It's got really good varieties. And if you're going to make ultimately friendly, accessible, juicy wines, Kakheti is a good place to do it. But it meant that at the same time as Georgia under the Soviets was the place where good food, good times and good wine came from, at the same time as the Soviets upheld this reputation and kind of mythology of Georgia as the land of wine, they smothered the inherent culture. And even up until 2006, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, 95% of Georgian wine exports went to Russia. This long focus, almost 100 years of focus on that one market, and that one market had a bit of a patronizing attitude to Georgian wine culture. They would have these almost pastiche, ye oldie worldy Georgian brands, and a big focus on innocuous whites, quite a lot of them sweetened, and these sweetened reds from Saperavi. Now, Georgia does have actually a good tradition of late picked Saperavi from the warm parts of Kakheti, which has the big structured wines with a little bit of residual sugar, but the residual sugar is natural. But what happened is, for many years, it was all about these cliched ideas of Georgia to supply the former Soviet Union. In 2006, the Russians banned Georgian wine exports, and it was aimed as a punishment. There was a war between Georgia and Russia at that time, and it was aimed as a punishment. But actually, although it was really tough for the Georgians, it actually saved the Georgian wine industry and brought them eventually back to a kind of global awareness. Because what had happened under the times of the Soviet Union is that the use of qvevri, and qvevri are these Georgian traditional clay vessels that have always been used to make wine in Georgia, and they, under the Soviets, were really discouraged. The Soviets really saw them as a kind of folk craft that was not part of a modern Soviet republic, and all of the official government wineries dispensed with the use of qvevri. And modern equipment was brought in. At the Alaverdi monastery in Kakheti, the old qvevri were used for storing engine oil. So qvevri were really dismissed under the Soviet times. And what happened as Georgia started to re-emerge from that is that you had this return by Georgians to this method that they knew was part of their unique culture. And what's happened since 2006 is that really it's qvevri and this unique method that has resulted in this sort of rebirth of Georgian expression and confidence in their own wine culture. And it's qvevri that has really opened up new markets for Georgia. And I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about qvevri winemaking. I should just say, in terms of volume, qvevri wines are less than 10% of Georgian wine production, but they are enormously significant for exports because they are really the pinnacle of Georgian wine production. A qvevri is a clay vessel that is installed in the ground in Marani. And the thing about qvevri is that they solve a lot of winemaking problems. This is a model qvevri. Qvevri vary in capacity. They can go up to 2,000 litres or 1,000 litres or 600 litres. They're installed in the ground, and what they do is they naturally provide temperature regulation, great fermentation circulation. When you put your grapes into a qvevri, so you go into Marani and this is poking out at ground level, the grapes go in, there's punch down once fermentation starts. The seeds, after fermentation finishes, fall to the bottom, to this little point here. Skins go on top. So the skins stop the bitter seeds from coming into contact with the wine. You have a natural settling. You also have a natural clarification. And winemakers, when they're making red wines, they will use typically a 2,000 litre qvevri because they know that the maximum fermentation temperature reached in a 2,000 litre qvevri is going to be sort of in the 20s, 20 degrees centigrade, 20 to 24. When you have a smaller qvevri, the maximum temperature reached is lower, so you use the smaller qvevri for white grapes. And so the thing about qvevri is that it's 10 times the man hours to make a wine in qvevri, because you really have to keep an eye on it. It's small batch, it's artisanal production. But qvevri do allow you to take a lower intervention approach to making wine, because it's a highly protective environment. It's not an oxidative method. People sometimes talk about orange wine or qvevri wine, and they'll talk about them like it's an oxidative style, like a rancio style. If you have a qvevri wine and it's oxidized, it's not typical. Qvevri is reductive because you have so much protection from air. This wine is staying under the skins and then on the skins with that protective covering for 6 months, and it's on the lees. So all of these things are actually naturally protective of wine. So there should be no reason for a qvevri wine to be oxidized. Lots of winemakers with serious enological qualifications use qvevri because they find that it allows them to make relatively small batch, really texturally interesting, lower intervention wines that they really like for their own qualities. This is a view of a Marani. Once the qvevri are installed, they are not going anywhere. So this is a massive investment to swap to this type of wine production. And what we're seeing in Georgia is that the adoption of qvevri started with very much small, family-owned. As usual, the kind of crazy visionaries working with this, maybe 1 or 2 qvevri. People like Iago Betarishvili, like John Werdman, like Gogi Dakishvili. They started off very much as individual pioneers. And what's happened now is that qvevri have really been adopted and reintroduced by pretty much every producer in Georgia, including many of the bigger producers who emerged from the post-Soviet era collectivized wine factories. The quality and the control of good qvevri winemaking in Georgia now is absolutely world class, and Georgia hosts regular qvevri symposia, and what we're finding actually is the qvevri technology is like old wisdom that's really empirical wisdom that has proved itself. So qvevri have really been the vessel by which Georgian wine has found its way back to contemporary relevance, because it was through qvevri that they opened new markets, and it's through those new markets that they've been able to export high value, truly Georgian wine. So their exports by value have soared, and the kind of wines that we're seeing in export markets like the USA, UK, Germany are really high quality qvevri wines retailing in the UK between £15 and upwards. And this in itself has then opened the door to awareness of this massive richness of Georgia, these amazing grape varieties. And although something like 90% of Georgian wine production is represented by Rakatsiteli and Saperavi and Mutsvani, but all of these other varieties, Khikvi, Chinuri, Hakuna, Kisi, Sulikari, Ojaleshi, all of these wines are actually being made and bottled now in tiny quantities, but the awareness, the research into these wines, the relevance of these grape varieties is absolutely established. And that is a trend that is just going and going. So you're really just starting to see the new rebirth, really, of Georgian wine and of this incredibly rich, amazingly rich viticultural heritage. These wines are not just interesting because, oh, they nearly died out. They're actually really delicious, fantastic wine grape varieties. So in 2016, there was 400 registered wineries. 2019, 1,000 registered wineries. There are scores of really dynamic, small family producers, but then there are more mid-range producers as well. And the big companies in Georgia are really on it. They've been able to get investment to modernize. So producers like Tibulvino, who are now imported by Bergman, they're one of the sort of the larger producers. They make both very clean, classic European style wines, but also delicious qvevri wines. Producers like, for example, Horgarten, and they import wines from Hareba, a similar kind of profile. You also have, for example, Teliani Valley, which was set up in the 1990s. That's now a big producer, now imported with really fresh, modern, contemporary wines in qvevri and classic European style. They're imported by Boutonneau. And at the same time, all the kind of the artisan stuff, you know, the people, the natural winemakers who are drawn to qvevri because qvevri does allow you to take a lower intervention approach. And also because I think spiritually, there's just something about the story and the, if you like, the soul of using these really ancient methods, that if you are a natural winemaker, you can see why there's almost like a spiritual attraction to using qvevri. But I would like to say that it's important to distinguish that qvevri doesn't equal natural. Qvevri is a tool, and lots of producers using qvevri, yes, you will usually find that there'll be lower added sulfites because the wine is very well protected. But qvevri as a category, or as a method rather, is just as varied and diverse as you would find in classic white winemaking. So as we start to wrap up, it's been a complete roller coaster for Georgia. So in 2006, this was the Russian ban. So imagine 95% of your exports disappearing overnight. So your wine was removed from your Russian supermarket customers' shelves and you didn't get paid for it. Since 2012, you start to see this growth and this huge focus on diversification of markets. And I just really like the fact that the thing that opened the markets was the treasure that they had all the time, but that was suppressed under the Soviet rule, which is actually this potential of qvevri, I think, to really connect with terroir and intent. New markets are incredibly important to the Georgians. So the UK and the US and Germany, what we buy from them is their most interesting, dynamic, artisan, high value wines. And so exports by value are going really well for Georgia. But the focus on diversifying these new markets with really the full and authentic expression of Georgian wine, natural wine, often usually made in qvevri from, in the UK, imported by people like Lecard Perrin. That was the thing that opened the door. And those wines are beautiful. There are some fantastic wines being made in that way. And that's expanded into more accessible qvevri wine styles from medium and larger producers. And now what we see is actually the next stage of Georgian expression, which is this incredible richness of grapevine varieties. And I know that, for example, Steve Daniel of Hallgarten, he was a pioneer in Greek wine and working with Greek indigenous varieties. The thing that he found really exciting was actually these conventionally made Georgian wines from these previously unknown varieties. So it's a really ancient wine culture, but actually it's kind of newborn in terms of global wine market. So this is the perplexing thing about Georgia. Yes, it's deeply ancient, but basically it's all brand new at the same time.